Hello world, and we are back. My name's Kyle Fischl. This is going to be episode 197 of my poker vlog. Before I get into the live poker, if you have any interest in playing with me online, I've had some pretty good results the last few weeks, playing in my own private club GG, making some big hands, and getting paid. So if you have any interest in playing with me online, message me on Instagram or Telegram. Today we're playing a 2-5 session at Sarasota, Florida, the One Eye Jacks Poker Club, and we have a bunch of interesting hands. Let's get into them. First hand of note. With a button straddle, the big blind decides to limp for $10. I look down at King 8 of hearts. I decided to raise to $30 from the under the gun position. Only the button and the big blind decide to call, so we end up going three ways to a decent sized pot. And the flop comes Queen Jack 10 Rainbow with one heart. This is definitely a board I'm going to c-bet, but I don't get the chance when the big blind leads for 40. I think this is definitely some kind of straight draw, maybe a weak single pair like Jack 8 or Pocket 9s, something of that nature. It can even be weaker since he's the big blind limp caller. Like, he could have like Queen 5 suited here and all kinds of stuff. Because he's a limp caller, he can almost never have Ace King here, where I easily could as an under-the-gun opener. So having an extreme nut advantage, I'm definitely going to raise this one with open-ended plus backdoor hearts. I make it $120.
Very aggressive, and you won't be pushed around.
The button gets out of the way pretty quickly, but the big blind's going to be a little bit sticky. He decides to come along. The turn is the Queen of Hearts. So we pick up backdoor hearts, but the top card turns into trips. When my opponent checks to me, I think I would easily play King Queen the same way here. Ace King probably doesn't slow down, so we're not going to either with our bluff, especially when we turn backdoor hearts. I decide to continue for $160, and my opponent goes deep into the tank. He goes back and forth for a little bit. He definitely physically looks like he's about to fold, but then he gathers the chips, so I really don't know what this means. Kind of weak looking, but also getting the money in hand, but he eventually does let it go, saying he had Ace 9 offsuit, so technically open-ended. And on this hand, the small lead into the pre-flop aggressor on the flop was a draw like I think it usually is. Following that, we are going to upgrade. Now we have King 9 of hearts from the small blind.
Upgrades, people, upgrades. That's how we make the dough.
A middle position player makes it $25. In the small blind, I decide to call. The big blind calls as well, so three ways to a flop, which comes Queen Jack 3 with one heart. I am first to act. I do not have the betting lead, so I'm checking. Thinking if I want to check raise or not. Overcard, gut shot, backdoor flush draw seems like a reasonable candidate, but I don't get the chance when it checks through. On the turn 7 of spades, we don't get our backdoor hearts, but when our opponent checks back the flop, I don't think they ever have top pair, even second pair all too often. So thinking that a lot of weakness might fold to a bet here, I bet $35. Additionally, the times I'm behind, I should pull ahead with any king on the river. 10 would obviously be a welcome sight, and even a 9 beats like pocket 8s, maybe 7-8 will continue this bet. But for $35, the big blind and the middle position player decide to continue, so we're going three ways to a river card. Definitely not going to bluff at it, but we are definitely not when the river is the king of diamonds. I think my opponent can easily have Ace Jack, Jack 10, Queen 10. A lot of those hands that are going to pay off a bet here, but we're going to go small here because we're targeting second pair. I bet $75. A little bit thin, but we got to go for some value in these thinner spots if we're going to make money playing poker. The big blind thinks for a little bit and then decides to call. Seems good. At least we didn't face a raise because Ace 10 is possible, I suppose. And the middle position player folds. I show King 9 confidently, and the big blind has pocket aces. Eat me! So, just called a middle position open, a small blind call with aces. No 3-bet from this opponent, and he ends up getting 2 bets out of me. One is a bluff, the second one only coming through when I river the top pair on the board. Not good enough, but we'll move on from there. On this fun hand of poker, I look down at Jack Queen of Diamonds from the button with three $10 limps because I button straddled. I raise to $60. The big blind then decides to limp raise to $220. Almost always I say this is like straight aces, but this opponent had been 3-betting quite a lot. And based on his playing, he's definitely a competent player. He's not a straight OMC that limped raised for the first time ever. So a few options are going through my head. Part of me wants to just rip here because I think he recognizes that I likely have a weak hand on the button. When there's many limps to me and there's a lot of dead money out there, I think he's just trying to re-steal what he perceives to be my steal. I think Queen Jack of Diamonds is definitely not a steal. It's just kind of a standard open. Part of me wants to just rip for like $1,200 because he made it $220. He didn't even 3x it. It seems to me on the bigger side like he's trying to get a fold because his hand is weak. But a 4-bet rip with Queen Jack suited just seems too big of a risk with $1,200 behind and him covering me. So I decided to just make the call, looking for any pair, any backdoor draw that I can get. But the flop is 6-4-3 with 2 clubs and 1 spade. Pretty much a disastrous board. I haven't completely lost hope yet because my opponent, if he does have a standard 3-betting range, shouldn't connect with this at all. And I could still have pocket 6s, 7s, 8s, all that stuff. But he loads up and decides to bet $190. Now, the second time in this hand, I think about just jamming with nothing. Just, it feels so weak. I don't know why this line doesn't make any sense from an opponent who's typically playing pretty well, but I just decided to fold. It is terrible that I have to waste $220 on a pre-flop bet and then not even get to continue. And my opponent confidently shows 4-5 offsuit.
You're a monster!
So I guess the rip pre would have been a little fun for me, but my opponent does the widest limp 3-bet I've ever seen ever playing live poker and gets absolutely rewarded for it. But the last hand had several difficult decisions in it. Let's try to play an easier one. Pocket jacks from the button. We didn't straddle this time because I guess we were punished on the last one. Either way, under the gun here opens at $20 and the low jack raises to $120. Just kidding. I guess it will be a hand with many difficult decisions. First off, do we call the 120 or do we raise? I mean, 4-betting jacks from the button feels gross. I mean, I'm sure some charts like it, but I'm going to choose a more standard, more passive line and just call. Play in position with jacks. Pot's already pretty big, 120 apiece pre. Because we go heads up to a flop where I'm immediately punished with a jack 5-3 2-spade board.
Red 25. Red wins.
I should have 4-bet, but hopefully my opponent has queens plus, some kind of overpaired's not going to give up. Oh, he checks to me. Well, we're not going to check. We have top set. There's a draw out there. Ace, king. Probably won't fold to a $75 bet, so that's what I put in. Hoping my opponent can pair one of his cards if he calls. Hoping for any card that's not a... Oh, the turn is the queen of spades. Only bad because it's spades. Like, I don't think my opponent ever has pocket queens here. I think ace, queen would c-bet at least at some frequency as well. But when my opponent checks to me, I guess I'm just going to go for some pot control. I don't think a worse hand can really pay 3 streets when I have so much of the board locked up. So we check back the turn, and the river is the 10 of clubs. I would say this one's moderately bad. I was hoping my opponent had ace-king when I did the flop bet, so now we lose to that one as well. But I think my opponent can have pocket 10s here some of the time, which would be great. So we're going to load up a large barrel. As I'm counting out chips, I was going to bet about 275 to 325. My opponent folds before I even put them in the middle, and he shows pocket 8s. So, yeah, there's a lot of overcards to 8s. Makes sense he's not going to call a large bet on this one, but would have been nice if he c-bet and we could have just raised on the flop and started building a pot, but my opponent a little bit cautious with one overcard to his 8s on this particular hand. But following that, with king 10 of spades from the low jack, there's an under the gun straddle. I raise to $35. The button, the big blind, and the straddle decide to call, so we end up going 4 ways to a flop. I don't think my hand functions particularly well multi-way, but on a king queen 10 with 2 hearts, it functions pretty well, I'd say. We lose to ace jack, jack 9, king queen, all which are somewhat possible from these players. Like, they could just call with any of that holding, but with 2 pair, we're not going to just be afraid of 3 specific hands. When we get value from like king jack, queen jack, 10 queen, lots of stuff, I bet $45. Only the big blind decides to call, and when we go heads up to a turn card, it is the 7 of clubs. At least it wasn't a heart this time, or a 9 would have been pretty bad as well. We can't really slow down here. There's so many draws out there. Maybe even a hand like king 9 feels pretty good to call a larger size bet. But we settle on just 100 this time, hoping like queen X and 10-9 can also stay in for this price. But my opponent does fold, and we win this pot, which is pretty good. 35 times 4 plus 45 on the flop. The medium-sized pots are definitely adding up for me today. Which brings us to our final hand of note. I have pocket jacks in the +1 position. With 3 limps to me, I settle on a sizing of $65. I think it's a good sizing. I think it's going to thin the field a decent percentage of the time. Love to take jacks heads up. But no, we get the small blind, big blind, and one of the limpers call. We are 4 ways with jacks. At least we're in position. And the flop comes 5-3-3. On this one, we're just going to size up really big. Our hand is almost always good, but vulnerable. Any face card or ace hits the turn and we're smoked. So we're going to bet 225 into 4 players. Definitely going for max protection, max value against like 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s are going to call this bet. And we can pretty much just get it in for $800 on relatively safe turn cards. But for this large flop size bet, it goes fold, fold, and fold. So we take this one down. Definitely a decent result on this one. We end up chopping a PLO double board bomb pot to give us a little bit more before we look at the final picture of the night, which would have been a profit of about $500 to $600 across 4 hours, which is a nice return on investment. But unfortunately for me, I punted all of it and then some off camera right before I was leaving. That is not what you want to do in poker. Yeah, so the hand that I alluded to that did not make it on camera, I'll go over it quickly. I have 7-8 of spades. With a button straddle, I'm in middle position. I make it 60. The button is the only caller. We are heads up to a flop, which comes ace, ace 4, 1 spade. I bet small here, thinking I have all the best aces in range. My opponent shouldn't have too many of them. I was the pre-flop aggressor. My opponent just called, but they min-click it. I decide to 3-bet this one. If I had an ace and it was a draw-heavy board, I would definitely try to get all the money in right now. So I decided to 3-bet the flop with this one. Want my opponent to be able to fold all their medium pocket pairs that are just kind of throwing a little test raise out there, seeing where they're at, as well as hands trying to name their own price with a diamond draw. My opponent calls the click back, and the turn is the 6 of spades. Pretty much the most gin card I could ever hope for. When I get called on a 3-bet, I think my opponent still has some diamond draws, still has some medium pocket pairs at least some of the time, and the weakest of aces are not going to like seeing a second barrel. So I fire $175 on the turn. My opponent does not take too long before making the call. Definitely not what I wanted to see, but have some outs to make a hand if needed. But the river is another 4. I think in all boards you have to have some 3-barrel bluffs. You can't just only have it when you're betting, because then your opponents could play perfectly against you. I do think it's possible my opponent could have jacks that got really sticky. And if King X of diamonds called, chasing their draw, and then went check, check, river, that hand specifically would be devastating. So when there are hands that will call the flop, call the turn, but then fold river, and we have no showdown value, we unblock the stickiest of 9s, 10s, jacks, all that stuff, I decided to just rip it in there. If I had an ace, I would play it the exact same way, but of course my opponent has the ace, and they're never folding. They have ace-jack off suit.
Oh, God, that hurt a little, but I'm all right.
No 3-bet, decides to raise flop with kind of a strange hand to do it with, and somehow it makes a disbeliever out of me, and I decide to blast off on this one specifically. And the moral of the story today is don't blast off when you have a decent amount of profit. It's unnecessary. Just take the win and go home. I turned what was about a $600-700 profit day into minus 150 to 200, so even just not throwing in the river jam for about 350 would have at least made today a profitable day. But on this day, we choose aggression, we choose violence, and the results are going to be violent for me. If you've made it all the way to this point, thank you. I appreciate it. Please consider subscribing. It helps me out more than you know. I'll see you on the literal felts or online felts, and I'll see you on the next one.